A court battle is brewing over voter photo ID. And we detail the key messages of this campaign season in this week's Capitol Report. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Capitol Report. I'm Julie Bartkey. It's been about a month since the end of the 2012 legislative session, and campaign season is now underway. We have Speaker of the House, Zellers, joining us on the Capitol Report set to talk a little bit about the campaign season. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure as always, Julie.
So, Mr. Speaker, let's begin with the message. The key message coming out of this last biennium was essentially moving from a budget deficit to a surplus without raising taxes. So again, it's been about a month since the end of session. How has this message resonated with Minnesotans?
You know, we hear from a lot of Minnesotans, probably when there isn't lots of bad news, you don't hear from them as often. The one thing we have heard from some business owners, and I was on a radio interview up in Alexandria a couple of weeks ago, and a guy said, "Kurt, it's Rod." I said, "Oh, hi, Rod," because we're old friends at this point now. He said, "You know, I'm really happy with what you guys did at the Capitol. I'm hiring more people. We're doing more projects. We're getting more out of the door." He goes, "We're about a month ahead of where we were last summer." So from that standpoint, that's actually what we hear about. The budget deficit was a big concern, obviously, last year, but now that we're beyond that, people are kind of looking towards the future. And if you're able to do more projects, hire more people, you know, get more work done, that's a very positive thing.
And so how do you move that message forward? And what are you saying to Minnesotans now as the November election draws near?
You need to stay the course. You know, we've seen what's been able to be accomplished without raising those taxes, but the other part of the equation is also reforming government. You look at where government has been in the last, say, even 15, 20 years, some of the updates that we haven't had, we're kind of still a hand-to-paper business. You come in, you hand somebody at the government a piece of paper, they initial it, they sign it, they approve it, and then they hand it back to you. We've got to introduce technology. That's what a lot of our initiatives did. A lot of the regulatory reform caught up with where our neighboring states are so that we're not 6 months or a year longer than maybe Wisconsin or Iowa. And then also making sure, that, again, to maintain that consistency for a business owner so when they're looking to expand, that businesswoman doesn't say, "Boy, I just don't know if it's the right time. I'm worried about that regulation or are the rules going to change." So maintaining that consistency for a business community is the most important thing.
The DFL message is that very little was done these last 2 years to even help the middle class, and that without Democrats stepping up and providing the votes for, say, bonding, virtually nothing would have been done to create jobs. So it's fair to say that you disagree with this statement. Do you think that the measures passed by the GOP perhaps generate as many jobs as bonding, or more so, or just differently?
Sure, one, and I'll speak on behalf of the middle class. Excuse me, my wife Kim's a school teacher. I work here and do a little bit of work outside the consulting at the Capitol. We're in the middle of the middle class, and you know what we have done in helping Minnesota business owners hire more people. I think that's the best thing you can do for the middle class. Making sure our schools, education reform is very, very important to a lot of our Minnesota families, looking to make sure that their kids not only have the best opportunity that they had, but even a greater opportunity, whether it's to go to a trade school, to attend a four-year college or university. So I think from that standpoint, those are the things we focused on because that's what Minnesotans want. If you're in the Democrat Party and you wanted to raise taxes, you wanted to make government bigger, you wanted to spend more money from the taxpayers' rolls on bonding projects, I could see where they didn't think that that was a do-nothing or a do-something session for them or a do-nothing legislature. I'm very proud. I voted for the bonding bill, was a co-author of a couple of projects in there last year, Nanotechnology Center for the University of Minnesota. Those projects, especially fixing local roads, bridges, things that are infrastructure-based, versus some things that would be really nice to have, civic centers or those pet projects that tend to pop up and people look at and go, why would government fund that? A bridge or some sort of project that really doesn't have a necessity, but it'd be a nice to have. So from that standpoint, I think most Minnesotans look at what we've done, look at the things that we're fixing up in their communities, a road or a bridge, and say, you know what, that's what government should be doing. We shouldn't be adding on to civic centers, competing with our local hotel owners, and we also shouldn't be adding rules and regulations to our books that make it hard for Minnesota business owners to compete.
A bill that you did not vote for was, of course, the Viking Stadium. U of M professor Kathryn Pearson contends that that stadium issue is what most voters are talking about even now. And she says that you are in a unique position given that the stadium passed without your support. So how have Minnesotans responded to this issue with you?
The one thing I hear a lot of is, well, I get that you didn't vote for it, but at least you didn't stand in the way, or you weren't petty and killed the bill, even though you could have. You know, obviously I hear a lot of folks, I've even had lots of Democrats and independents say, hey, look, I would have never supported you in the past, wouldn't vote for you on a number of the issues. Yeah, I want to raise taxes, I want to see a number of things, but your support for not making us liable for that stadium, I actually will vote for you. So it's been a unique experience since then. It has died off a lot. We don't hear about it at the door, and I've been out door knocking some of the newer areas in my new district. You don't hear about it at the door, but if there is one message, it's consistent of, well, I get that you didn't vote for it, but at least you didn't kill it or you didn't stand in the way. You let a fair vote come to the floor. And you know, as you know, you've heard that many times from us in the press conferences. That's what we maintained all along, is it would be a fair process.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, I want to talk a little bit about the two constitutional amendments. About a week ago, several groups did petition the Minnesota Supreme Court to remove voter photo ID, the amendment question, from the ballot due to concerns about the accuracy of the wording. The legislature, of course, you know, is among those working to keep the measure on the ballot. You were quoted on NPR on June 8th stating, "It is unfortunate special interest groups who are opposed to photo ID are using any means necessary to prevent citizens from voting on this important election integrity measure." So why do you think the legislature should actively engage in the court process?
Well, two reasons. First and foremost, I don't believe that the language is misleading at all. You know, and most Minnesotans, I think, when they go to the polls this fall, will read it and say, should I show my photo ID when I go to vote? Absolutely. I do it all the time, whether it's getting on a bus, whether it's, you know, picking up your kids at a daycare center, whether it's, you know, writing a check, which very few people write checks anymore, but if you do. So from that standpoint, it's very simple language. It's a very simple process. You are who you say you are when you go to vote. And for I talk to a lot of high school kids, if it's their first time voting, they want to make sure their vote counts. And if it's 1, if it's 100, if it's 10 that are disenfranchised because they don't think their vote counts because somebody else voted twice or shouldn't have voted and canceled their vote out, that integrity is very, very important to the process. And then secondly, just as an institution, the legislature has that authority granted to it by the Constitution. I felt very important, whether I'm still in a leadership position in the House or not, the legislature should have that authority to pass legislation that goes before the people, and that the courts or an outside group shouldn't be able to interfere with that process. So it really is about affirming the legislature's authority, not just the House or Senate Republican authority.
Okay, and finally, the other ballot initiative is that to define marriage as a union between one man and one woman. The polls on this are fluctuating constantly. Do you think ultimately that this ballot initiative is going to help or hurt the GOP?
You know, I think overall, it's just that the people are going to get to vote. We've watched now for a long time, as long as I've been down here, people on both sides of the issues use the issue for their own personal political gains, whether you're for it or against it on either side of the issue. So I think it's probably about that time where the people just say, and then the people's will is going to be heard in at the elections and at the polls this fall, where whether you're for it or against it, whether that's the definition or not. And then I think Minnesotans are ready, kind of like Wisconsinites were ready for the recalls to be over, that the discussion is then over. We've had the discussion, we've now had the vote has come, it is what it is, whether it's 50% or 51% or 55%, either way. At least then the decision's been made by the people and not by folks inside politics using it for their purposes. So I think at the end of the day, I don't know who will be hurt or harmed by it. That's for the people to decide, but at least the decision will be made by the people.
Okay, Speaker of the House Kurt Zellers, we're out of time, but we thank you for your time.
As always, really, anytime.
There is a next step to be taken before voters can decide the fate of voter photo ID. Several groups are challenging the ballot measure in court. And this Legislative Coordinating Commission hearing on the issue authorized the legislature to retain counsel and actively defend the measure.
A variety of interest groups and individuals filed a petition in the Supreme Court on May 30th. Those groups included the League of Women Voters Minnesota, Common Cause, Jewish Community Action, and a number of named individuals. And among the attorneys representing them is counsel from the American Civil Liberties Union. This is a statutory proceeding filed under Minnesota Statute Section 204B.44, which is also known as the Errors and Omissions Statute. And essentially what the petition does is allege that the ballot question presented and passed by the legislature for the photo ID constitutional amendment contains a variety of errors and omissions.
We're taking an unprecedented step to intervene. First time we've ever done it. We're going to be expending state tax dollars on this to pursue this litigation. In addition to the tax dollars we're spending on other lawsuits, and I want to make sure that the argument that we're going to be making is not. It's the argument to be made that this is not misleading, that the ballot question is not misleading, as opposed to making the argument that it's exclusively our decision and the courts can't even look into it. Because that's an argument, he said it was dicta, that someone could make.
We do have exclusive constitutional authority to provide the form and manner, subject to the court's palpable evasion. And not being a lawyer, I don't know exactly how palpable evasion is described and used by the courts. But your argument gives weight to the idea that we do have standing, because the legislature took a very strong position, and now we're subjecting the legislature's strong position to court review. And so I would think, as a legislator who intends to go further in his legislative career, you would want to support the idea that when the legislature takes a strong position, we do have an inherent right to stand before the court and affirm that position.
Here to give the House DFL message on the campaign season and the 2012 session in general, we have House Minority Leader Paul Thissen. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely.
So, Leader Thissen, let's begin with the key message of the GOP being in the majority. Coming out of session, it stated that balancing the budget without raising taxes was, of course, the big message. Now, it's been about a month since the end of session. How do you think this message is resonating with Minnesotans?
People don't believe it. Because it's not true. The budget isn't balanced. We still face about $4 billion hole that we're going to have to fill when we come back next January. And also the way that it was done. In a way, borrowing from our schools, having this IOU to kids, taking the tobacco bonds. It just wasn't a fiscally responsible way to balance the budget. If I'm the Republicans, I can see why they're pointing to that, because they really have nothing else to point to. But it's just simply not false, and Minnesotans don't believe it.
So let's talk about what the DFL is pointing to, that little was done these last 2 years, essentially to help the middle class in particular, and that without Democrats stepping up to create jobs, it might not have happened, particularly with bonding and the stadium bill as well. So do you think that this message is enough to take a majority of seats back in the House?
Oh, I really do. I think the Democrats clearly demonstrated a couple things. One, people are really frustrated with the dysfunction in government, and we showed that we're willing to step up and actually lead and govern, and I think that's important to Minnesotans. Secondly, it's very clear that this middle class squeeze that we've been seeing for a long time is continuing, and that people are very concerned about it. They've seen their property taxes go up as a result of Republican decisions. They've seen tuitions go up as a result of the Republicans' historic cuts to higher education. They've seen their class sizes in their schools grow. It's important for people to remember the Republicans actually proposed cutting education before Governor Dayton kind of convinced them at the end of the day that at least we should hold them harmless. And so all these things contribute to this middle class squeeze that we've been seeing. People are frustrated out there, and the Democrats are the ones that are stepping up and saying our priority is the middle class. The Republicans have demonstrated, in fact took the state to government shutdown to protect the wealthiest Minnesotans and big corporate special interests. I think that's really what this election is going to be about, and it's not just the politics of it, but it's this question of how do we actually grow an economy that's going to work for most people. And I think our answer is we need to grow a middle class so people have money in their pockets that they can go out and spend in Main Street small businesses, just getting out of the way of big corporations on the wish and the prayer that that's going to trickle down to the rest of us, which is kind of the Republican approach and philosophy that they've demonstrated through their votes and over the last 2 years. It hasn't worked, and it's not going to work. We need to grow this middle class, and it's resonating with people.
It is resonating? Is that what you're hearing?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the two ballot initiatives coming on in November as well, voter ID being one of them. It is going to be heading to court. Excuse me, and about a week ago, several groups did petition the Minnesota Supreme Court to remove the amendment question from the ballot due to concerns about the accuracy of the wording. The legislature is among those working to keep the measure on the ballot. Where does the House DFL stand on the issue?
Well, I think there's a lot of questions to be answered specifically about whether we should get involved in this lawsuit. In fact, it's unprecedented. That's the first time that the legislature would actually intervene and become a party in someone else's lawsuit. That's never happened in state history. So it's a big step. Plus, it costs a lot of money, and we don't have a lot of money over here at the state. On the larger issue, though, I do think that it's a legitimate question for the court to decide, because what they're talking about in the ballot question, it just focuses on this photo ID and that you're going to get free IDs. But what the impact of this amendment would have would be essentially to eliminate, from my perspective, absentee balloting in this state in any meaningful way, not allow soldiers overseas to send in their ballots, and really have a huge impact on same-day registration, which has made Minnesota a leader in voter participation in the state. So I think there's a very legitimate question that needs to be decided about whether this ballot question is accurate.
According to most polls, the majority of Minnesotans are in favor of voter ID, though. So what do you think the outcome will be if it is indeed on the ballot?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenging one for the folks that are trying to defeat it. And I think if it's just about whether you should show an ID at the polls, I mean, that comes with a lot of implications for disenfranchising people. But I also get why the average Minnesotan looks at that and says, okay. But when you start thinking about the fact that you're not going to be able to vote absentee, you may not be able to have same-day registration in the state, when those consequences start to roll out, I think that there's a possibility. And I actually take a little comfort in the defeat of the property tax amendment up in North Dakota. I mean, it shows that people in this country, and I think it's very true of Minnesotans, are actually willing to step back and look at, okay, what is this really going to mean? And amending the Constitution, I think people feel, is a big deal. So I still think that there's a legitimate and good discussion we're going to have before November.
And what about the ban on same-sex marriage, the definition of marriage as a union between one man and one woman, to use the official terms?
Right.
Do you think that Minnesota could be the first in the nation to defeat this proposal?
Oh, I really, really do, and I think the polls are starting to reflect that. And as we talk to people, on the campaign trail, again, people, may have different views on that issue, but amending the Constitution is a big deal. And at the end of the day, Minnesotans have a very fundamental sense of fairness, and they're understanding that this amendment really isn't fair to friends or neighbors, to people that they know. And when that starts to sink in with folks, then I think that they really come around to saying we shouldn't be putting this in our Constitution. And in addition to that, I think that kind of the scare techniques that have worked in other states are going to work less well in Minnesota, because people have more made up their minds one way or another. There's not as many people kind of in the middle, undecided about this issue. And those kind of fear-based political ads and attacks only work less well unless people are more undecided.
Do you think having these ballot initiatives on the November ballot, do you think they're going to help or hurt the GOP?
Well, I think in particular the marriage amendment is going to help the DFL, the legislative candidates, and especially in some seats that are in swing districts that we need to pick up. College towns, St. Cloud, Northfield, Moorhead now with Representative Lanning retiring. These are all places where I think that the youth who really oppose this amendment and are motivated to turn out on that are going to turn out more, and then they'll ultimately support Democratic candidates.
Voter ID?
I don't think voter ID is actually going to influence legislative races one way or the other.
Okay. Finally, excuse me, Leader Thissen, I wanted to ask you what you think about what happened in Wisconsin with the failed attempt to recall Governor Scott Walker. Do you think that this is kind of a reflection of the appetite of Midwestern voters right now?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that was a unique circumstance, a recall election with a governor, and with kind of a time delay after the real fight that happened last summer. What I think is most interesting is that it's prompted the folks here, the Republicans here in Minnesota, to just dig in even further on their fundamental message, which is we're going to do everything the same next year that we did over the last 2 years. And in the face of a huge budget deficit that we're going to be facing, that doesn't make a lot of sense and should make Minnesotans, I think, really uncomfortable, because if we have this huge deficit and the Republicans are saying we're not going to be doing anything different, what I think we can expect is another shutdown at the end of the next session. That's not what Minnesotans want. They want us working together, they want us moving forward, and they don't like this divisive politics that underlies that. This idea that because someone is getting something, we should take it away from them. I mean, that's really at the heart of, it's a politics of jealousy that the Republicans, a politics of envy that the Republicans Republicans are really pushing forward. And it doesn't make sense, and it's not. I don't think it's going to work. What we need to do is actually grow middle-class jobs and work together to make sure that that happens.
On a scale of 1 to 10, where would you place your confidence level that the House DFL can win the majority with this election?
Oh, I think it's going to be a hard-fought election, but I think, I would put it at a 7 or an 8.
Okay, with those words, thank you so much for joining us, Representative Paul Thissen. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Here to give us a bit of a high-level view of the 2012 legislative session and the messages heading into the campaign season, we have Dr. Kathryn Pearson from the University of Minnesota. Doctor, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Let's begin with that particular question and give me your impression of the legislative session and what you think the key message or messages are leading into this campaign season.
Well, legislators and voters alike will be talking about the stadium. The stadium received the most press. It was at the end of the session. Voters on both sides of the issue were wondering what's going to happen. And of course, it dominated the press coverage and the messaging coverage as well. It was one of the governor's highest priorities. And then, of course, the legislature, for its part, promised to get it through, but it became very complicated because, of course, some Republicans were strong proponents, but many in the Republican leadership actually were not in favor of the Viking Stadium. But they really fulfilled a promise to actually just procedurally move forward on it, even with opposition. So,
and given the fact that it was not a caucus position, how do they take that stadium and take that into the campaign season individually? And say, for example, Speaker Zellers, we had him on a bit earlier in the show. How does he incorporate that into his message, given that he didn't support the bill?
Right. Well, it's complicated for him because at one level, all politics is local. So, of course, his constituents, like all legislators' constituents, will want to know, what was my legislator's vote and what was the rationale. But the leadership also has the responsibility of keeping the trains running on time, so to speak, fulfilling promises. And so the Republican leadership didn't want to be seen as blocking a proposal that did have a lot of support, but at the same time, individual leaders are accountable to their constituents to be reelected. But they do have to wear both hats, and so voters may find that complicated. But where it will matter most, of course, is in the most competitive districts. So even though people are passionate on both sides, many incumbent legislators don't face strong challengers. So even if they find themselves at odds with some of their voters on their position, without a quality challenger running against them in a competitive race, it won't matter. But where it will matter is, of course, in these competitive districts where legislators took a position that could be at odds with their constituents.
Let's talk about the 2 constitutional amendments that'll be ballot initiatives. One defining marriage, as a union between one man and one woman. The other requires voter photo ID at the polls. Now let's talk first about for lack of a better phrase, we're going to just say the ban on same-sex marriage. There's speculation that Minnesota could be the first state to defeat this. What do you think?
Well, this is an issue where public opinion is changing most rapidly. So political scientists typically see a lot of stability in public opinion on most issues, but gay rights, gay marriage is one notable exception. So here, public opinion is moving quite quickly, especially among young voters. And so I think the question is, will young voters show up at the polls? Now, presidential elections always garner high turnout. Minnesota is often the highest in the nation. It certainly was 4 years ago. So we expect that turnout will be high. But I think the question is, will disaffected voters on both sides of the aisle, both liberals and conservatives, who perhaps aren't overly enthusiastic about their party's nominee, will they turn out and vote for or against the amendment?
Do amendments tend to drive people, though, to the polls where even if somebody is a bit disenfranchised?
The most important driver is, of course, a presidential contest. And so we already have that going on. But at the margins, this could matter. And again, especially among the most liberal voters and the most conservative voters who perhaps might think that their presidential nominees are too moderate.
So no projections on whether or not Minnesota will defeat the measure?
This is going to be extremely close either way. The polls right now suggest that it will be defeated, and opponents do have one advantage, and that is, of course, that if someone simply doesn't vote on the constitutional amendment, that essentially still matters for the denominator, so counts as a no vote.
Okay, let's talk about voter photo ID. It's heading to the courts right now. Do you think if it makes it on the ballot, it has a chance of passing as well?
This does have a chance of passing. Polls have overwhelmingly shown that voters do support voter ID because sort of at the most basic level, it sounds like a pretty simple simple issue. But once the messages start going out that there's really a lot more to voter ID and who it would disenfranchise, that could change. So I think this one really depends on the messaging and to what extent the opponents of voter ID are able to get some of the complexities out there. But if it were voted on today, it certainly would pass.
Do you think the ballot initiatives are going to hurt or help the GOP at the polls, considering they want to obviously maintain the majority?
Yes. So I think it will do both. So I think it really depends on the district. I think in some very conservative districts, it will mobilize voters. The same is true in liberal districts. But I think at the margins in these very competitive districts, that's where it will make the difference. And I suspect that's where supporters and opponents of these amendments will spend the most time, because those swing districts will make or break these amendments. And at the same time, they will affect the candidates running in these competitive districts.
And caucus leaders will, of course, argue that job creation was a priority for every caucus, and each argues that it helped create jobs in different manners. Who do you think wins this message?
Well, they'll each argue that they help create jobs, but then they'll also be launching bombs at the other side. You know, Republicans, for their part, will talk about all of the bills that Governor Dayton vetoed, over 50. And on the other hand, the DFL will talk about the importance of stopping Republican proposals that would have hurt teachers, labor unions, et cetera. So I think both sides will be armed with talking points, and this will be the defining issue of the campaign. So I think it really depends on which side is better able to convince voters that they've done a good job handling the economy so far and that they'll do better in the future.
Finally, Dr. Pearson, we saw what happened in Wisconsin with the failed attempt to recall Governor Scott Walker. So in your opinion, is this a reflection of the appetite of voters in the Midwest?
Well, the critical issue with the voter recall of Governor Scott Walker is that, of course, voters were not only voting for or against Scott Walker and his policies, which were well known to voters. I mean, it was a very polarized debate. They were also voting on whether or not they thought it was appropriate to have a recall. So if you look at the exit polls, a combined 70% of voters either thought recall elections were never appropriate or only appropriate in really extreme cases. And here was an issue of a recall where there were clear policy divides, but it wasn't so clear that there was corruption or fraud or some of the other elements that most voters thought were appropriate for a recall election. So does it illustrate the diminishing power of labor unions in general? Yes, but we've seen that for many years in this country. But does it suggest a sea change in politics for Wisconsin or the Midwest? I don't think so, because even in the same exit polls, those voters who voted to recall the governor, or excuse me, voted against recalling the governor, were by a 7% margin also supportive of re-electing President Obama. So that 7% margin is only half what his 2008 margin was, but it still suggests that each race has the potential to be different, and there's no one race that's a bellwether for national politics.
And finally, I lied because I do have one last question, but it seems to be a very intriguing race from a national level all the way down to a statewide level, and for local offices as well as for a political analyst. What do you think of this?
Oh, absolutely. Because both at the federal level and, of course, here in Minnesota, we're seeing the consequences of divided government, which is to say both sides have an agenda, and that agenda is thwarted because neither side has control of the executive branch and the legislature. And in an era of polarized politics, which is what we're seeing, that means that not a lot gets done. You could easily have a scenario where divided government means a lot of compromise and bipartisan legislation, but that's not what we're seeing. It's not what we've seen in Minnesota, and it's not what we've seen at the national level. So despite the fact that the electorate is closely divided, the policy positions of the two sides are quite distinct. So it really will be an interesting battle.
Okay, Dr. Kathryn Pearson, thanks for your words. We appreciate them.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that wraps up this week's program. From all of us at Senate Media Services, I'm Julie Bartkey. Thank you for watching Capitol Report.